Thank you very much. As many of you will probably know, Professor Susanna did a number of visits at the beginning of this year to... Is that not good enough? Is that better? Okay? Is that okay? Did a number of visits to laboratories and institutes around Europe to talk about different ways of setting up a research institute. And we spent a day at Wallingford discussing various aspects of that. And she asked me today to talk about the sort of how you might do that in terms of different institutional structures. And so this is not about my particular organisation. This talk is about different ways of doing it and different ways it's been done in the UK. I don't claim that this is the right way or the best way. It's just simply illustrating different ways of doing it. So I'll first of all try and explain a little bit more about what a research and technology organisation is, and if I slip into shorthand, I will talk about them as RTOs, but I'll try and use the full set of words. I'll talk about different ways of setting them up, what we call governance models, and then try and explain why we believe in the UK they are needed, why they're necessary. And from that it follows what are the benefits both to industry and to academia. And then I'll look at some applications and how you fund the sort of work that a research and technology organisation can do. Okay, so why am I qualified to talk about this? Well, I've spent my entire career in essentially different forms of research and technology organisation. I started off with a major international consultancy where we did things like set up the first coastal modelling group in the UK outside of academia. I then moved to a research laboratory where the task was for the ports industry to take what was a government research laboratory, so civil servants, and make it a commercial entity. So that was a transitional job, again with a focus on research. And most recently I was at HR Wallingford, where my role was to promote the research agenda, both within the organisation and internationally. So the theme here is really all about how do you get from research to something that's useful to the wider society. So it's not the quality and the excellence of the research that's in discussion here, it's how do we make it useful to other people. But from a researcher's point of view, he wants his research funding. From a practitioner's point of view, he doesn't care about the research a lot of the time. He just wants a solution to his particular problem. And the problem with this is that to bring the two together, the researcher needs to understand the problem, and the end user has to have some concept of the art of the possible. What's coming down the track in terms of new research that actually might be useful to them. And to bridge this, you need some sort of common understanding that can then let you promote user-driven research. And traditionally, and in a lot of countries still, this came about by the end user having time to visit different universities, sit down, talk with the academics, and frame the research that was needed to be done. I can't speak for Brazil, but in the UK in particular, that has changed. And it's changed because of the drivers behind each of the individuals. The driver for the academic now, if he wants to be promoted and taken seriously as an academic, is to publish, and to publish in top-level journals. The driver for somebody working in industry is by and large profit. And the time he can spend travelling around different universities, finding out what's going on, has been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. So that's why we need a mechanism to deal with this bridge between the academic and industry. And in the UK, this is referred to as the intermediate sector, where the intermediate sector is working at taking what academics do and making it useful to industry, and at the same time feeding back what they identify as industry's problems so that academia is better informed about what research problems would have a genuine end use. And this is often referred to as a sort of valley of death in terms of how you get across from one to the other. And this slide here, this part of the slide, shows what they call technology readiness. And academia is generally over here. Industry is selling things that are genuinely ready, so it's to the right of this graph. And there's a gap. And getting across this gap often requires a lot of very mundane work and a lot of money. And that's where this intermediate sector, particularly in things like manufacturing, comes in. Now, in Europe, we have a number of organisations that actually support this sector. The European organisation is there to promote the role of research and technology organisations to the European Commission, to make sure that the Commission understands the important role this group plays in the overall European economy. And the role of AIRTO within the UK is similar in terms of promoting what the research and technology organisations do to the UK government. But it also serves a function of allowing the different research and technology organisations, often in completely different disciplines, to share their experience about how they get funding, how they train staff, how they develop new ideas, and so on. So they're both very useful associations, and I've put the links on the slide for you. So these organisations, as I've said, operate in very different disciplines, and I'll show you a few of those in a moment. But a study by Oxford Economics showed that they also make a very important contribution to the UK economy. They also employ a lot of people. So 3 billion to the UK economy, something like 60,000 high technology jobs. So this is generally employing people with degrees, PhDs and masters and so on. And most recently, AIRTO updated it and reckoned that last year they were contributing of the order of £4 billion sterling to the UK economy. So what I want to do now is look at 7 different examples. And I'm doing so many because there are a number of different ways that these organisations are organised, so different governance models. And these are all drawn from a number of different sectors, loosely related to the sort of subjects we're talking about today. So the first one is British Maritime Technology. This was a merger back in 1985 of a research association, so people became members of an association because they had an interest. So that membership association joined with the National Maritime Institute, which is essentially civil servants. They formed a company, but it's a company where the assets are entirely owned by the staff. There's no shareholders. It operates mainly in the marine industries, and it now does a range of things, taking work, sponsoring work in the universities, and then working all the way through the development phase to commissioning and application in industry. And it's mainly, as I say, in maritime industries. The next one is very different. It's called the National Physical Laboratory. Actually, what it does is sort out how to measure things accurately and repeatably. It turns out that the National Physical Laboratory is a major contributor to the UK economy. It currently operates in a rather unusual model. The staff are government employees, but the organisation is managed and operated by a private company. So all the offices, the facilities, the contracts, administration are all done by a private company. At the moment, that's this company, Serco. It's just been out to a new tender, it's been re-tendered, and actually now, this time round, 2 universities are going to take on the management of this laboratory. So it's a rather unusual model. The third example is the Building Research Establishment. Again, a very long history from the start of the 20th century. Again, formed initially as a research station, so all government employees. In the 1990s, it was made an agency of government, so rather than being civil servants directly employed, they were one removed. And then it was privatized at the end of the 90s. Again, different model. BRE is a charity. So it's not a company, it's a charity dedicated to research and education. It gets its money from either membership or people contracting them to do research. And interestingly, the BRE's timeline shows how institutes and laboratories evolve over time. And you can see here, this goes back to 1921, this is 2012, how different research laboratories have emerged, become necessary, joined together to form new organizations, and then in some instances split apart again or stopped operating. So it's also important to recognize the changing nature of need and how laboratories need to, or research and technology organizations need to adapt to those changing needs. My next example is an organization that I ran for a little while, ABP-MER. This is Marine Environmental Research. ABP-MER itself has a long history because it was set up in 1950 as a government research laboratory for the ports industry. But under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, the ports industry was privatized. And a company that was quoted on the London Stock Exchange, Associated British Ports, was formed, owning 22 ports. And the research laboratory was included as part of that stock-quoted company. So here was a research laboratory owned by a stock-quoted company. But the staff were essentially all still civil servants. So there was a transition to be done from being civil servants to having a much more commercial focus in the way they went about things. And they now are still a very healthy company where their focus is environmental research, and they do a lot of work not only for the ports, but also advising government because of the quality of their output. So there's no compromise here in the quality of the output just because they're in the commercial sector. And finally, in terms of the examples, I come to HR Wallingford, where I've been working recently. Another example of a government research station set up in the 50s. And the original objective here was you've got hydraulics being researched in academia, and engineers at the time were not using it. So the purpose of the organization was to help engineers make use of loose boundary hydraulics. It went through a number of evolutions. Again, this is another organization that was privatized by the Conservative government in the 1980s. A different model again. It has a membership which has almost no function because it doesn't, again, have any shareholders, so it doesn't distribute profit. The profit that this company makes is fed back to fund research, and I'll show you a bit more about that in a moment. In terms of what it does, it's still there to promote the use of the latest hydraulics and environmental science within the engineering community. It operates globally now, and it has a primary role of translating academic research into applications, tools, and solutions. Now I want to come to the most recent innovation in the UK. These are called catapults. Do not ask me why they're called catapults, because I have no idea. They're modeled very loosely on the institutes in Germany called the Fraunhofer Institutes, which are probably Europe's largest and most successful application-oriented research organizations. The aim within the UK is to establish some world-leading innovation centres, helping business to transform new ideas into products and services. And the UK and industry together are planning to invest about £1 billion over something like the next 5 to 10 years. And the aim is that they'll add a new dimension to the operation in the UK, and it comes about because in the 80s and 90s, the government changed its focus and pushed universities to do research and believed that the simple model of universities doing research and setting spin-out companies up would be an industrial success. Now that works in some sectors. It was particularly successful for pharmaceuticals, but it doesn't work more generally. And there's more recently been a realization that actually you do need this intermediate sector to do the translation. And this is a busy slide, but it just summarizes the 7 catapults that have been set up to date. Some of them are not particularly related to what we're talking about today, like cell therapy, but offshore renewables obviously is very appropriate. The focus of the offshore renewables is actually nothing to do really with the sort of things we've been talking about. So it doesn't, for example, cut across the work of H.R. Wallingford and environmental research, because the focus of this centre is to try and reduce by an order of magnitude the cost of putting marine renewables into the sea. At the moment, it's disproportionately expensive, so the aim of the centre is to drive down the operational costs of this type of installation. But the centres overall are about providing critical mass to the particular focus. They're about providing facilities and infrastructure to help industry get things moving. But most importantly, they're about bringing groups together so you get academia and industry talking together in a meaningful way. So what are some of the benefits? And I think in this morning's discussions, we heard many of these a number of times, that there are things that these research and technology organisations can do that can't really be done by other parties. One, for example, is providing long-term programs, and I'll show more about that in a moment, about the time it can take to take research and get it into operational use. And alongside that, doing things like long-term monitoring and securing data archives is another important role. And support for this transition across what's the so-called valley of death, getting things into operation, often also takes a long time. So it's another important role. We've also heard about the provision of facilities like large laboratories, ship facilities, and again, that's an important role that these providers can deliver. Another important part of what they can do is really focused on this translational role. Government and industry generally need information in the right format for them to make use of it. And research outputs themselves don't always lend themselves to direct interpretation as evidence, either by government or by industry. In particular, by government, they want robust evidence. That often means they want multiple lines of argument. The evidence has to be credible, and therefore they have to test it in different ways. So often they don't want the research from just one academic. They want several lines of evidence to understand the consistency and the conflicts, so they can make a judgment about where the evidence lies, or where the evidence suggests they should go. Equally, there's a need to translate research often into information which goes beyond the research in terms of interpreting the findings into something for a particular application. And what's often not realized, I've worked on projects where the research outputs have been, let's say, £100,000. The cost of interpreting those research has been the same again. So it can be a substantial effort to go from research output to information and evidence. And another important point from an academic point of view is often that evidence is not publishable by the people who did it, it's publishable by the people who paid for it. And that's a big difference. So let's look briefly at the research cycle. This was briefly shown this morning. We have the universities who focus essentially on the fundamental research and some applied research, but then we have the need to get from methods and tools to projects, collaboration with external parties, and perhaps commercial software. Now, a research and technology organisation like HR Wallingford operates just in this sort of space. It can get a bit of money for applied research, but its primary role is generating these sorts of tools to support project work and in some instances develop commercial software. What a research and technology organisation can particularly do, however, is make use of this feedback. Through doing projects, they find out what they can't do. And that's a really important feedback back to the development of applied research programs. In a similar vein, it's worth just reflecting on the time it takes to get research into application. And there are two examples on this slide, and this is a timeline from the 1980s through to 2010. The first one is the concept of using probabilistic methods for flood defence design. There'd been some work, particularly in the offshore oil industry, developing these concepts back in the 80s. And a number of people approached the UK government in the 80s suggesting that this would be a good thing to use for sea defence design. It took almost 10 years to convince them that it was a good idea and for them to fund some research on this. It took another 10 years to get that programme through and actually delivered, and another 10 years to get it into operational use by the agencies that do coastal design. So it's not a quick process. Similarly, the Estuary Research Programme, slightly different approach. The funders insisted that the first phase of the programme was to deliver something that was usable immediately. So the initial phase of the research was to document the research already done in a way that it could be used by those working in consultancies and the Environment Agency and the like. Only then was more money provided to advance the science. But even that, you can see, is a timescale of about 15 years. So it's not a quick process. And finally, to funding. For a research and technology organisation, and again I'm drawing on HR Wallingford as the example, some funding is provided by clients like the Environment Agency who want a specific piece of research doing. So they have defined objectives of the research that they want to see delivered. We then have other clients who, they don't have some research they want, they have a project need. And there are some clients who actually don't even want you to mention the word research. So if you're working from the oil and gas industry, it's often not a good idea to say we've got to do some research before we can answer your problem. They want the answers to their problem. But on the way to getting their solution, you may need to do some research. So again, that's a funding stream for research. Then obviously, there's working with the universities on curiosity-led research, so working with higher education institutes to do either PhDs, master's theses, and so on, another vehicle for progressing some part of the research agenda. And then for an organisation like HR Wallingford, the profits they generated are fed back in to feed, to be able to support internal research, which is all about filling the gaps that these other things... Oops, sorry, can you put that back on? So you get a quick recap, if you can read fast enough. So the internal research is about filling the gaps that these other three areas don't necessarily cover. And that was one of my roles at HR Wallingford, was to design the research programme that delivered that. And what we're doing is trying to move things that are done essentially strategically to things that support the particular market need. So in summary, research and technology organisations within the UK now constitute an important part of the research and innovation landscape. They are making a substantial contribution to the UK economy. Importantly, they're providing this transition mechanism from research in academia to industry or government. The degree of independence they have, both from government and from industry, allows them to operate in a mixed economy, which means they can adapt quite rapidly to changing circumstances. And therefore, they can also be quite responsive to particular end-user needs. And as I hope I've illustrated, there isn't just one way of doing this. There's a plethora of different ways of doing it, and certainly those are all very successful institutes within the UK. Thank you very much.